Welcome to the Apartment Operators Podcast, where you can learn from experienced operators what it really means to be an apartment operator. No fluff, no sugarcoating, just the raw, unfiltered truth of the ups and downs of operating multifamily communities.
Everybody, Joseph Gozlan here, and I first wanted to apologize for all the attendance of the MFINCon conference in North Carolina and Charlotte this last week. I was supposed to present, and thanks to American Airlines and a bunch of delays in the flights, I couldn't make the conference, so I do apologize. I figured I'm going to record the video because a lot of people were interested in the panel, and I already did all the work to prepare the presentation, so I figured we're going to make a video and send it to everybody. So the subject of this presentation today is based on a lot of interviews we've had in our Apartment Operator podcast with apartment operators. And most of the people that had a certain scale, and we talked to them, said they switched over to self-management. And this is what the conclusions we had. This is why most of them chose. So let's get started. Today, in our presentation, we're going to introduce a little bit myself and what we do in our company, so you'll know how I got all that information. We'll talk about the factors that a lot of our guests have shared with us of what they were considering when they made the decision to go self-management versus third party. We talked about the challenges that everybody has working with third party. We talk about some horror stories, and we'll talk about the math behind it. And then we'll talk about the benefits of self-management. And finally, I wanted to give it a little bit of a tie to where we are in the current market cycle and why the decision could be even more critical in the next couple of years. So a little bit about us, the Eureka Business Group. We are vertically integrated. We've been in real estate since 2005. We're owners, operators, syndicators, sponsors. We have our own commercial property management company, a podcast, a book published, and so on. You can see all the different companies that we run on the screen. A little bit about myself. I started investing in 2005, got licensed in Texas in 2009, at the beginning of 2009, which, as you can imagine, was just the world was on fire. Everything around us was crashing. And my wife and I were lucky enough to recognize that this is the best market to be in, probably in our lifetime. And there might be another one coming up in the next couple of years, but that's been over the decision back then. We didn't survive the crash, we thrived it. We bought singles and duplex and whatever we could, and the only thing I wish back then is that I knew about multifamily back then. We bought and operated over $40 million of multifamily and other commercial real estate here in Texas. My background before I went full-time real estate was in the software industry. I worked for large corporations. And that book on the screen was a little passion project of mine. This is what got me started in real estate. The reason I got asked to do this presentation is because I have a podcast. The podcast is called the Apartment Operators Podcast. Over the last few years, we've interviewed about 40 strong operators, and the cumulative, we're looking at tens of thousands of units under management, billions of dollars in AUM, and we've interviewed operators as small as 80 units all the way up to tens of thousands of units and more. If you want to see the podcast, if you want to subscribe, APTOPR.com is our website. We are on iTunes, Stitchers, SoundCloud, and anywhere you consume a podcast, you can find us.
Control over where to invest.
People bring management in-house to control it better.
We started management out of necessity just from the pure neglect that we saw happen on our own properties.
I like control. I control this. I run this.
My property is not managed in the way that I want it managed.
Have that control.
But you can maintain more control over it if you do it right.
We probably perform better only because nobody really manages it like they do if you own it.
I like being able to control what's going on in the properties.
It's not a profit center, it's more of a brain damage center, but the control allows us to make more money on the ownership side and for our investors than using a third party.
Control.
Yeah, so I wanted you guys to hear directly from our guests, and this is just a sample. A lot more of them said the same thing. The two main things that we've heard from our guests about self-managing is the word control, and nobody will care about your property the way you do. And it's absolutely true. We'll talk about why it's true, but nobody said it's a profit center. Nobody said it's for my ego. Nobody said it's because I wanted cool shirts with a logo on them. Nobody said anything like that. Everybody came down to control and caring about your property. So let's talk about when somebody makes a decision, should I go with a third-party management or should I go self-management? There are a few main factors that should be calculated into this conversation. One is, can you do it? Not everybody is built for property management. Not everybody is capable of doing the property management work, and not everybody have the skill set, the knowledge, and so on. So if I've never invested in multifamily and I joined a few partners or I won the lottery and I bought a 400 unit apartment complex, can I go in and create my own self-management company? A lot of people are not capable of doing that. So that's why you got to be honest with yourself and say, hey, can you do it? The next question you want to ask yourself is, am I local to the properties? If I bought a 300 unit apartment complex in Seattle and I live in Texas, managing this thing or creating my own self-management from that distance is going to be very challenging. The other questions I want to ask myself is, do I have the scale to do that? If I bought an 8 unit in Philadelphia and I live in Texas, that's too far, and 8 unit is not big enough to support a maintenance guy or an on-site manager, a leasing agent. So I'm going to have to depend on other people from the outside to help me run the show. And scale is a very critical factor in the decision. Do you have the time to do it? Don't kid yourself. You cannot create your own property management company. You cannot self-manage with 2 hours a quarter. That's not going to happen. You're going to be basically building a new company. You're going to be building a new business, and it will require times and resources, at least at the beginning. Now, if you're at the scale when you have already 10,000 units and you can hire an executive VP that has 30 years experience and just tell them, go run with it, different conversation. But most people don't get all the way down, far down that road before they make the decision to do self-management. Just a factor to consider is, do I have the time to invest in creating a whole new company, new processes, new systems, and so on. And then a very important question is, can you afford not to do it? Again, if I bought a 400 unit property that's worth, let's say, $100 million, and I paid $30 million for it, and I paid cash, I am well capitalized, I'm cash flowing, I'm doing great. I can afford not to do self-management. I can afford to have a third party not be the most optimized, most efficient, and so on. And we're going to circle back to this question when we're going to talk about where the market is going in the next couple of years. The can I afford not to do it is a very important question that you want to ask yourself when you make the decision. A third-party property management, they are professionals. They've been doing that for many years. That's their job. That's their livelihood. They must be better than me. Why would I ever consider doing self-management when I can hire a professional to do that? I wouldn't try to represent myself in court. I would hire a professional, wouldn't I? While on the comparison to an attorney sound right, it's not exactly the same. And that's the reason why a lot of the big operators have decided to transition to self-management. The challenges that we're dealing when we're hiring a third-party property management is that, first and foremost, as an industry, we still haven't figured out a good model to incentivize those third-party property management companies. We pay them off the top. We pay them a percentage of what they collect. Doesn't matter if the property is making money or not making money at the end of the day. Doesn't matter if you're cash flow positive or negative. They get paid off the top. You say, okay, then let's incentivize them by paying them a piece of the NOI. We can do that, but then it's just another incentive to defer maintenance, for example. So the expenses are not going to be so high. NOI is going to be greater. They're going to get paid more. So no matter how you spin it, there is going to be a conflict with the way we incentivize the third-party property management and the way that we need them to perform. And we'll get into specific details in a little bit when we'll talk about the math behind this. Another challenge that we're dealing with, and this is where the attorney example falls apart, is that we buy very expensive commercial real estate, $10 million, $50 million, $100 million, even if it's $1 million piece of real estate, but we hand over the keys to an on-site manager that makes $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year. And that is something that is mind-boggling. That is something that is pretty crazy to think about, but it's the reality. That's how this industry is operated. The other thing is, and again, ties back into the person we put in charge at the helm, is that they don't necessarily, in most cases, understand the financial model and how it works. They don't understand the difference between spending on this or spending on that. They don't understand the difference that every dollar in the NOI impacts the valuation of the property. Another challenge that we have with third-party management companies is the lack of transparency. In many cases, as the owner or the operator, you will be 3 to 4 layers away from the actual people in the trenches. So you'll have your on-site manager, you'll have your regional, you'll have your VP, and you'll have the ownership of the property management. And depends on which level you're interacting with, you're going to be 3 or 4 levels away from the actual people in the field. Now, granted, there's a lot of operators that work with third party and they skip levels. They go down and they talk to the regional or they talk to the actual on-site manager. And some operators, myself included, when we had third party, I would show up a lot on site and I would talk to the on-site managers and I would talk to the leasing assistants and the maintenance guys and even the residents. Can you bypass it? Yes. But in many cases, a lot of the operators are just disconnected from the field by being about 3 or 4 layers away. And then one of the other challenges that is pretty new for the industry is that our residents are getting younger, but the leadership in the companies that are out there is getting older. So we have a little bit of a break in communication between the regional and the senior VP that's been doing this thing and been in the industry for 30, 40 years. And at the same time, they have a barrier with communicating with millennials and communicating with Gen Z that are now getting into the market, and they just communicate differently. It's not only the words that they're using, which are absolutely different. It's also the way they prefer to communicate, the way they need things handled for them and done for them. So we have this as a new challenge in the industry that we're going through. And then in some cases, you can find yourself in a misalignment of culture. And that means that the culture that we as operators and owners want to make sure that our company is putting in place is not necessarily the culture that the property management company has, because it's their business, it's their organization. They have their own culture and they had it before they met you. And 9 times out of 10, the culture that's going to be driven down to the people in the field is going to be the property management company's culture and not your culture. And that's for the very basic fact that the people in the field are employees of the property management company and not your employees. So we have that as a challenge as well. So let's talk a little bit about the horror stories that we personally went through and some of our guests shared over the years in the podcast. Just a little bit of our personal experience in February of 2020, after we fired 2 third-party companies in a row, we've decided to just bite the bullet and create our own property management company. And the last company we fired, we basically inherited a dumpster fire. And to say a dumpster fire is underrating it, it's simplifying the situation, but let's just call it that. And then to top everything off, 3 weeks later, the world exploded. Right? COVID just came and became a thing. Shutdowns, lockdowns, mass hysteria, stimulus checks, and eviction moratoriums, the whole 9 yards, right? And if you asked me in April or May 2020 if it was a smart decision to go ahead and do my own property management company, I would say, oh my God, no, that was the worst time. But hindsight is 2020, and I can tell you post fact that if we didn't take our management in-house, there is no way we would have survived COVID. And I can say that flat out with no hesitation and no doubt in my mind. So what kind of horror stories have we encountered and some of our guests encountered? We've had embezzlement. We've had theft. We've seen our guests talk about sweethearting. And if you don't know what sweethearting is we would see leasing agents and managers basically waive late fees and give recurring discounts and all kind of stuff for residents that was not part of the company policy, that was not approved by anybody. We've seen all of that. We've had drugs abuse on the property by employees. We've had neglect. I can share one of the horror stories about neglect. One of the properties we took over management, there was a young guy, he was maybe, I don't know, late 20s, early 30s, that came in very irate, very vocal, very yelling and upset into the office. It's been 6 months, it's unacceptable, this is a real problem. And like I said, dumpster fire. We did not know what was going on. There was no good tracking on the work orders, and a lot of them were closed even though they were never handled and so on. I told him, okay, let me go with you to your unit, show me what's going on. And this guy takes me to his apartment. It's a 1-bedroom apartment with 1 bathroom. And he opens the faucets in the bathroom and nothing comes out. He goes, I don't have running water in my bathroom for the last 6 months. And this was just neglect, nothing else, because 45 minutes later, and a junior maintenance guy was already there, replaced the faucet, everything was resolved. So to say that neglect was going on, it's not fair to the resident. It's not the company culture that I wanted to have. And this was part of the challenges that I was talking about earlier. We had incompetence, which is very sad. We had inefficiency. We had flat out stupidity. It's just sad, but this happens too. I can share another story. We had a manager on site that her daughter happened to be a resident on the property. And somehow every month that daughter of her was getting a resident referral credit on her rent every single month. And the way we picked up on it is not because the third party management had a checks and balances, God forbid. It's because we as an organization dug into the system and into the records and realized that, wait a second, this unit gets a referral credit every single month. So either we have the best ambassador type residents in the world and we need to recognize that person and celebrate them, or there's something wrong there. And of course, once we dug in, we realized that this was flat out embezzlement, because the people that the credit was given for told us, I don't know that person. I never heard about them. We've had a lot of really horror stories shared, and I encourage you to listen to the podcast and hear some of the horror stories and the funny stories and the sad stories that our guests shared over the years. So let's talk about the math, and I mentioned that earlier, and talk about how a third-party management is not compensated the right way to incentivize the kind of attention and work that we as owner needs to have on a property. So this is one of our own properties that we owned, and I personally found that issue, and that was something that we needed to address. One of our properties had a master cable and internet agreement. That basically, if you've never heard about that, it's basically we paid the cable and internet company X dollars a month, let's say $30 a month per unit. And then we turn around and we can, in the leases, charge the resident for that package. So in that case, we had $65 charge in every single lease. That was one of the addendums for that property. And the residents were happy because back at the time, there was no other internet and cable package you could get for $65. They all started at $80, $90. So it was a great deal for them. It was a good deal for us because we were making the difference between that and the amount that we had to pay for the master lease. And everybody were happy. The challenge is, like I said, we were paying about $30 to $35 per unit. We would have that difference in income as additional income for the property. After digging and going through every single ledger and every single lease, we did an audit. We found 55 residents that had the lease addendum, but the charge was never set up in the system. For not having that recurring charge in the system, they were never charged, thus we never collected. So if you do the 55 residents times $35 that we were missing, 12 months, that's $23,000 a year in income that we were not collecting. And this is where it gets interesting. So for us as owners, at a 5% cap rate, that $23,000 a year is $500,000 loss of value, 462 to be exact. It's almost $500,000 that we lost in the property value, which is, everybody would say, significant to any owner. But here's the thing. For the property management company, if they get paid 3% management or even 4%, do the math, that's $700 a year. That's less than $60 a month, which means they can't even take an employee to sit for 2 hours and do that review on the property. Because it takes more than 2 hours to go through all the leases and all the ledgers in the system to make sure everybody's charged everything. We do not incentivize our third-party property management accordingly. So on one hand, as an owner, I'm looking at it as like, I pay you to do your job. This should be part of your job. I expect you to do that. But as a business owner, I'm looking at it and I'm saying, wait a second. It's like, I'm asking them to spend more money than I'm giving them in order to do the job. And the only way to solve this that I found, right, and I'm open to hear you, please put a comment on the video or shoot me a message if you're interested to have the conversation. But the only way I can see this being resolved is because as the owner of the property management company and the owner of the property, if it's the same ownership, because we do self-management, then I will eat the difference in costs, the quote-unquote loss of that extra man hours labor that is going to be done on the management side of things, because I'm making $500,000 value to the property. This is that disconnect that we were talking about. This is the challenge that we have in this business, and this is why a lot of those cases are just failing. So let's talk about self-management. Remember the two things that we talked about? Control and nobody cares. So on the control side, I can get to have my own culture, my priorities, my systems and processes, and I only gonna spend dollars that I have approved to spend. On the management, on the care side, I get employee retention, and that drives resident retention, and I can prevent deferred maintenance, which will cost me more down the road. And it's that simple. It's really that simple. One of the other horror stories that we've heard from our guest is they had their maintenance guy going to Home Depot 4, 5, 6 times a day every time they needed a little piece. And of course, every time a maintenance guy goes to Home Depot, that's a trip, right? That takes an hour and a half. They take their time. They're scrolling through the aisles. I personally have seen maintenance guys put Mountain Dew and a candy on the material receipt and so on. With self-management, I can have my processes. I can have control over everything that happens and not let things like this happen. I want to wrap this thing around with talking about the current market and why I think self-management is going to be critical in this coming economy. As the economy is not doing so great these days. This is recorded in June of 2023. Inflation is still out of control. Rate hikes keep happening. The Fed just froze for the first time the rate hikes after 10 consecutive or 15 consecutive raises. We're not doing good, and it's not going to get better anytime soon. We're headed for an election year. Inflation is still out of control. Nobody's going to tighten the belt or apply taxes or close things down in an election year. So we're not going to get improved anytime soon. The labor markets are not getting any better. Chick-fil-A is paying $19 per hour right now. Walmart distribution centers are paying $24, $26 an hour plus benefits. So it makes it really hard for the management companies, whether you own it or not, to pay $12, $13, $14, $15 an hour for a make-ready guy or a grounds guy. We're going to have to really watch every single dollar that we're spending going forward. Looking at the market right now, as multifamily owners, we're looking at most markets in the country are going flat, or even some go a little bit negative, some go slightly growing, 2-3% in rent, while our expenses are growing at least double digits in the last 2-3 years. Everybody's looking at the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, for inflation numbers, but in reality, we don't buy cheese and bread for the properties. We buy concrete and metal and paint and sheetrock and lumber. And these things have grown up insanely over the last 3 years, not 4%, more like 40%. In 2020, late 2022, lumber went down a little bit, but concrete went up. Metal still is up. Appliances are really hard to find these days. We're not in a great place to be in, and that translates to a shrinking NOI because my expenses are growing faster than my income. So even if I have a fully stabilized property, my NOI is going to shrink. It's just a fact. Can self-management help? Yes, and that's back to control and caring, especially tightening up the controls over every dollar that's going to get spent because the market is constraining our rent growth. Now, we're not talking about value add. We're not talking about a place where you buy a property and you can put some capex and get the rent raised for that. We're talking about stabilized properties, or once you have stabilized your property, control is going to be the key word over the next couple of years. So, like I said, on the control side, we're going to have tighter budget control. We're going to be able to scrutinize every single dollar that is getting spent. We're going to make better or smarter or more focused hiring decisions. And they're going to be able to leverage your brain power compared to other people and that might or might not be able to think outside the box or to think creatively like you would. On the nobody will care side, again, driving employee retention means better efficiency, means also higher resident retention, and that leads to less turnover. Less turnover means less expenses. That's really where it is. In the self-management world, care and control, the two C's, are going to be the driving effect and the driving factors for your profits to make things better for you and your property versus letting control go and hoping for the best. A few quick tips. First, find help. There is no need to reinvent the wheel. You can hire people that have experience. You can consult with people that have experience. You can hire experienced property management companies to be your consultant and help you set up the initial processes, hire the initial people, and then you can choose what of their culture you want to borrow and what of their culture you want to dump and bring your values into it. Leverage technology as much as possible. The new generation, the Gen Zs and the younger millennials, they prefer texting. They prefer in-person technology in order to communicate. They want to be able to create work orders from their phones. They don't want to make a phone call. They don't want to talk to anybody. Leverage technology as much as possible. Leverage technology in your marketing. Leverage technology in your leasing process. Leverage technology in your signing documents process. Wherever you can leverage technology. Use offshore virtual assistants. This is something that is becoming more popular recently, but hasn't been part of this industry ever until now. And personally, we've used VAs to help with prospecting, schedule tours for the leasing agent. We had them follow up on work orders. One of the things that was really a game changer for us was to tell the managers or anybody on site not to enter invoices. That saved us a lot of headache on the accounting side, on miscategorizing things, on missing invoices. We told the office people, you know what, just take a picture with your phone or scan at the scanner and email that to the VA. And the VA was trained and she had a manual of this invoice goes to that ledger account and this invoice goes that and that vendor goes there. And suddenly our accounting became much cleaner and much more easier to read. Trust no one. This is a lesson learned in the hard way. Build checks and balances for every role, from your maintenance guy to your leasing agent, all the way up to your VPs. Build checks and balances. Teach your on-site manager how to read a P&L. It's just insane, again, that some of them, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of managers out there that knows how to read the P&L. But the majority of those that I've come across from our properties and our clients' properties, they don't interact with the P&L at all. They don't look at the expenses. They don't look at anything. They just look at their delinquency and their work orders. And that's something that you want to change, because when you help them understand that every dollar matters, that every dollar for the NOI changes the valuation of the property, your life is going to get a little bit better. Incentivize the right behavior and not the outcome. So I've seen that a lot, and that is very common with the third-party property management. They want leasing bonuses. If I have a leasing bonus, and only the leasing bonus, I'm not saying go away with leasing bonuses, I'm just saying if that's the only way for you to incentivize your leasing agent, then the behavior you're incentivizing is a new lease. So if somebody's coming up for renewal, they're incentivized to let them go away, and so they can bring somebody else into that unit so they can get the leasing bonus. Versus if you incentivize retention over a new lease, then in that case, you're creating a behavior that means that everybody on staff have to treat that resident better. They have to make sure the work orders are done in a timely manner. They have to make sure that they're always pleasant when that resident comes to the office. They have to make sure that the property is always clean. They have to do a lot of different things, because retention is not just a price factor. At least 9 times out of 10 is mostly a price factor, especially in the B- and C class environments. So if you incentivize the right behavior, you will get the right outcome. But if you incentivize a specific outcome, you might not incentivize the behavior you want to incentivize. And then don't wait. This is, again, something we learned from talking to a lot of operators. Don't wait for that magical number. I've heard a lot of people say, I'm waiting until I have 1,000 units, until I have 800 units. They have this magical number that once they cross the threshold of that magical number, then it makes sense to go self-management. But in reality, we had operators that started self-managing from the first day. James Kandasamy, very successful operator, thousands of units already bought, sold, and managed, made a lot of money for his investors, very successful guy. But he started self-managing with the first property was like 30-something units. So there's no reason to wait until you get to a certain scale. And then not all numbers are equal. What does that mean? It means that if I have 500 units all in one city, all the properties are within 2 miles from each other, I have enough scale. But if I have 500 units that are 30, 40 units in every state, now I got a problem. I don't have enough scale in every single place to afford one person even. Don't look for a magic number. Look at your entire operation and make that decision based on all the factors that we talked about today. When is it the right time for you, if it is the right time for you, to make the decision to go from third party to self-management? And don't get me wrong, I still know some operators that are pretty big and very successful that swear by third party. They say, I will never self-manage and I don't want to deal with that. And even though they went through some of the horrors that we talked about earlier, they're still resisting going to self-management. And that's a personal decision, and you should make your own. That's it. I hope this was helpful. Once again, I'm sorry I got to miss everybody on the MFINCon in Charlotte, North Carolina this year, but I promise I will see all of you guys at one event or another. My contact details are on the screen if you want to talk shop, if you want to discuss, disprove me, present a different argument on what I talked about today. I'm more than welcome in any open discussion. And even more than that, if you're an apartment operator and you want to be on our podcast, absolutely send me a message and we would be happy to interview you on our podcast and share your experience with the rest of the world. So hope everybody enjoyed this thing, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for listening to our show. If you want to enjoy more episodes, please subscribe on iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, or SoundCloud. For questions or feedback, please visit our site at www.aptopr.com.